Welcome to PseudoPod, the weekly horror podcast. Beneath the surface is a world of gliding monsters, one you can choose not to step into or leave at any time. PseudoPod, episode 566, October 27th, 2017. This week's story, Flash on the Borderlands XL, Halloween Street by Steve Rasnic 10. Hello everyone, welcome to PseudoPod, the weekly horror podcast, and welcome to Halloween Street. Welcome to the road that's there all year round, but for some reason we can only really visit this month. Welcome to the street where every house that isn't the Niebolt house is the Dianea house. Welcome to the boulevard of dreams that have been broken and stitched back together with more enthusiasm than talent. Welcome to Halloween Street. Welcome home. This episode, we're going to showcase one of the all-time greats. Steve Rasnic 10 is one of the finest horror authors on the planet, and his work, and his street, will form the basis of this episode. We're going to start with Halloween Street itself and details of each story's provenance. Steve's last novel, Bloodkin, came out from Solaris in 2014 and won the Bram Stoker Award. His new novel, Ubo, came out in February of this year, again from Solaris, and is a dark science fictional tale about violence and its origins, featuring such historical viewpoint characters as Jack the Ripper, Stalin, and Heinrich Himmler. He is also a past winner of the World Fantasy and British Fantasy Awards. Recently, a collection of the best of his uncollected horror, Out of the Dark, a storybook of horrors, was published by Centipede Press. A handbook on writing, Yours to Tell, dialogues on the art and practice of fiction, written with his late wife Melanie, has appeared from Apex Books. In the fall of 2018, Hex Publishers will be bringing out Steve's middle grade novel, The Mask Shop of Dr. Blark. Halloween Street was originally published in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, July 1999, and was nominated for both a Stoker and an International Horror Guild Award. Our other three stories this week, Tricks, Butcher Paper, and Masks of Me, were originally published in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, December 1999, as part of Tricks and Treats, One Night on Halloween Street. Halloween Street itself was reprinted in Steve's collection, Celestial Inventories. Steve said when we talked to him about these pieces, I've always had a thing for Halloween stories, having published over half a dozen of them so far. Perhaps because it is the one time of the year that even conservative repressed types celebrate the dark side. Certainly it's become commercialized, and kids and adults running around in scary masks no doubt have little or no understanding of the deeper meanings of the figures they are emulating, but to my mind that only heightens the frisson. We wear masks of monsters and the dying, while hiding from ourselves that we are indeed monsters and dying. We're a funny race. So, let's take a walk down Halloween Street, starting with the titular story itself. Let's get ready to go trick-or-treating. Our first stop is just over here, and our first narrator is very familiar. Halloween Street. No one could remember who had first given it that name. It had no other. There was no street sign, had never been a street sign. Halloween Street bordered the creek, and there was only one way to get there, over a rickety bridge of rotting wood. Grey timbers had worn part way through the vague red stain. The city had declared it safe only for foot or bike traffic. The street only had 8 houses. No one could remember more than 3 of those being occupied at any one time. Renters never lasted long. It was a perfect place to take other kids, the smaller ones or the ones a little more nervous than yourself, on Halloween night, just to give them a little scare, just to get them to wet their pants. Most of the time all the houses stayed empty. An old lady had supposedly lived in one of the houses for years, but no one knew anything more about her except that they thought she'd died there several years before. Elderly twin brothers had once owned the 2 centre houses, each with twin high-peaked gables on the second story like skeptical eyebrows, narrow front doors and small windows that froze over every winter. The brothers had lived there only 6 months, fighting loudly with each other the entire time. The houses at the ends of the street were in the worst shape, missing most of their roof shingles and sloughing off paint chips the way a tree sheds leaves. Both houses leaned toward the centre of the block as if two great hands had attempted to squeeze the block from either side. Another 3 houses had suffered outside fire damage. The blackened boards looked like permanent, arbitrary shadows. But it was the 8th house that bothered the kids the most. There was nothing wrong with it. It was the kind of house any of them would have liked to live in, painted bright white like a dairy so that it glowed even at night, with wide, friendly windows and a bright blue roof, and flowers that grew naturally, and a lawn that seemed immune to weeds. Who took care of it? It just didn't make any sense. Even when the kids guided newcomers over to Halloween Street, they stayed away from the White House. The little girl's name was Laura, and she lived across the street from Halloween Street. From her bedroom window, she could see all the houses. She could see who went there, and she could see everything they did. She didn't stop to analyze or pass judgment. She merely witnessed, and now and then spoke an almost inaudible hi to her window and to those visiting on the other side. An occasional hi to the houses of Halloween Street. Laura should have been pretty. She had wispy blonde hair so pale it appeared white in most light, worn long down her back. She had small lips and hands that were like gauges to her health, soft and pink when she was feeling good, pale and dry when she was doing poorly. But Laura was not pretty. There was nothing really wrong about her face. It was just vague. A cruel aunt with a drinking problem used to say that it lacked character. Her mother once took her to a lady who cut silhouette portraits out of crisp black paper at a shopping mall. Her mother paid the lady $5 to do one of Laura. The lady had finally given up in exasperation, exclaiming, "The child has no profile!" Laura overheard her mother and father talking about it one time. I see things in her face," her mother had said. "What do you mean?" Her father always sounded impatient with her mother. "I don't know what I mean. I see things in her face and I can never remember exactly what I saw. Shadows and white. Something so white. I feel like she's going to disappear into it, like clouds or a snowbank." Her father had laughed in astonishment. "Oh, that's crazy. You know what I mean," her mother shouted back. "You don't even look at her directly anymore because you know what I mean. It's not exactly sadness in her face, not exactly, just something born with her, something out of place. She was born out of place. My God, she's 11 years old. She's been like this since she was a baby." "She's a pretty little girl." Laura could tell her father didn't really mean that. "What about her eyes? Tell me about her eyes, Dick." What about her eyes?" "She has nice eyes." "Describe them for me." "Can you describe them?" "What colour are they, Dick? What shape?" Her father didn't say anything. Soon after the argument, he'd stomped out of the house. Laura knew he couldn't describe her eyes. Nobody could. Laura didn't make judgments when other people talked about her. She just listened and watched with eyes no one could describe, eyes no one could remember. No, it wasn't that she was sad, Laura thought. It wasn't that her parents were mean to her or that she had a terrible life. Her parents weren't ever mean to her, and although she didn't know exactly what kind of life she had, she knew it wasn't terrible. She didn't enjoy things like other kids did. She didn't enjoy playing, or watching television, or talking to the other kids. She didn't enjoy. Really? She had quiet thoughts instead. She had quiet thoughts when she pretended to be asleep, but was really listening to all her parents' conversations, all their arguments. She had quiet thoughts when she watched people. She had quiet thoughts when people could not describe her eyes. She had quiet thoughts while gazing at Halloween Street, the glowing white house, and all the things that happened there. She had quiet thoughts pretending that she hadn't been born out of place, that she hadn't been born any place at all. Laura could have been popular, living so close to Halloween Street, seeing it out of her bedroom window. No other kid lived so close or had such a good view. But, of course, she wasn't popular. She didn't share Halloween Street. She sat at her desk at school all day and didn't talk about Halloween Street at all. That last Halloween, Laura got dressed to go out. That made her mother happy. Laura had never gone trick-or-treating before. Her mother had always encouraged her to go, had made or bought her costumes, taken her to parties at church or school, parties the other kids dressed up for, ghosts and vampires and princesses giggling and running around with their masks like grotesquely swollen heads, but Laura wouldn't wear a costume. She would sit, solemn-faced, unmoving, until her mother finally gave up and took her home, and she'd never go trick-or-treating, never wear a costume. After she told her mother that she wanted to go out that night, her mother had driven her around town desperately trying to find a costume for her. Laura sat impassively on the passenger side, dutifully got out at each store her mother took her to, and each time shook her head when asked if she liked each of the few remaining costumes. "I don't know where else we can try, Laura," her mother said, sorting through a pile of mismatched costume pieces at a drugstore in a mall. "It'll be dark in a couple of hours, and so far you haven't liked a thing I've shown you." Laura reached into the pile and pulled out a cheap face mask. The face was that of a middle-aged woman or a young man, cheeks and lips rouged to bright red, eyeshadow dark as a bruise, eyebrows a heavy and coarse dark line. "But, honey, isn't that a little—" Laura shoved the mask into her mother's hand. Well, all right." She picked up a bundle of bright blue cloth from the table. "How about this pretty robe to go with it?" Laura didn't look at the robe. She just nodded and headed for the door, her face a mask already. Laura left the house that night after most of the other trick-or-treaters had come and gone. Her interest in Halloween actually seemed less than ever this year. She stayed in her bedroom as goblins and witches and all manner of stunted, warped creatures came to the front door, singly and in groups, giggling and dancing, playing tricks on each other. She could see a few of them over on Halloween Street, not going up to any of the houses, but rather running up and down the short street close to the houses in I Dare You races, but not near as many as years past. Now and then her mother would come up and open her door. "Honey, don't you want to leave yet? I swear everybody will be all out of the goodies if you don't go soon," and each time Laura shook her head, still staring out the window, still watching Halloween Street. Finally, after most of the other kids had returned to their homes, Laura came down the stairs, wearing her best dress and the cheap mask her mother had bought for her. Her mother and father were in the living room, her mother having retrieved the blue robe from the hall closet. "She's wearing her best dress, Anne. Besides, it's damned late for her to be going out now." Her mother eyed her nervously. "I could drive you, honey." Laura shook her head. "Well, okay. Just let me cover your nice dress with the robe. Don't want it to get dirty. She's just a kid, for Christ's sake. We can't let her decide." Her father had dropped his newspaper on the floor. He turned his back on Laura so she wouldn't see his face, wouldn't know how angry he was with both of them, but Laura knew. "And that mask! She looks like a whore. It's a whore's face. Hell, how can she even see? Can't even see her eyes under that." But Laura could see his. All red and sad-looking. "She's doing something normal for a change," her mother whispered harshly. "Can't you see that? That's more important." Without a word, Laura walked over and pulled the robe out of her mother's arms. After some hesitation, after Laura's father had stomped out of the room, her mother helped her get it on. It was much too large, but her mother gasped, "How beautiful!" in exaggerated fashion. Laura walked toward the door. Her mother ran to the door and opened it ahead of her. "Have a good time," she said in a mock, cheery voice. Laura could see the near panic in the eyes above the distorted grin, and she left without saying goodbye. A few houses down the sidewalk, she pulled the robe off and threw it behind a hedge. She walked on, her head held stiff and erect, the mask's rouge shining bright red in the streetlights, her best dress a soft cream colour in the dimness, stirred lightly by the breeze. She walked on to Halloween Street. She stopped on the bridge and looked down into the creek. A young man's face, a middle-aged woman's face, gazed back at her out of dark water and yellow reflections. The mouth seemed to be bleeding. She walked on to Halloween Street. She was the only one there, the only one to see. She walked out in her best dress and her shiny mask with eyes no one could see, and the houses on Halloween Street looked the way they always did, empty and dark, except for the one that glowed the colour of clouds or snow. The houses on Halloween Street looked their own way, sounded their own way, moved their own way, lost in their own quiet thoughts, born out of place. You could not see their eyes. Laura went up to the White House with the neatly trimmed yard and the flowers that grew without care, its colour like blowing snow, its colour like heaven. She went inside. The old woman gazed out her window as goblins and spooks, pirates and ballerinas crossed the bridge to enter Halloween Street. She bit her lip to make it redder. She rubbed at her ancient blind eyes, rubbing the dark eyeshadow up into the coarse line of brow. She was not beautiful, but she was not hideous either. Not yet. In any case, no one ever remembered her face. Her fine, snow-white hair was beautiful and long down her back. She had the most wonderful house on the street, the only one with flowers, the only one that glowed. It was her home, the place where she belonged. All the children who dared, came to her house every Halloween for treats. "Come along," she said to the window, staring out at Halloween Street. "Come along," she said as the treat bags rustled and shifted around her. "You don't remember, do you?" as the first of the giggling goblins knocked at her door. "You've quite forgotten," as the door began to shake from eager goblin fists, eager goblin laughs. "Now scratch your swollen little head, scratch your head. You forgot that first and last, Halloween is for the dead." Next up, we have Masks of Me. This is narrated by Daniel Braum. Daniel is the author of the short story collections Night Marches and Other Strange Tales from Cemetery Dance in 2016, and The Wish Mechanics, Stories of the Strange and Fantastic from Independent Legions Publishing in 2017. His short stories have appeared in publications including several appearances in Cemetery Dance and anthologies including The Beauty of Death 2 and Night Scripts 3. He is the host of the Nighttime Logic reading series in New York, and you can visit him at bloodandstardust.wordpress.com. And the truth is, well, we all wear masks, don't we?
Masks of Me. Ronald went to the door and was surprised to see a little boy standing there wearing a mask that looked just like Ronald's own face. "Where'd you get that mask of me?" Ronald asked, but the little boy just turned and ran away. Ronald went out on the front porch and yelled as loudly as he could, "Where'd you get that mask of me?" But the little boy just kept on running and never looked back. Ronald jumped off the porch and ran after the little boy. Behind him, he could hear his mother and father calling after him in panic, but Ronald kept running, just knowing that he had to catch that little boy and find out about the mask of his own face. "I won't hurt you. I just want to know about that mask of me," he called. But the little boy just kept getting further and further away, like he had leopard legs or something. Leopard legs and Ronald's own face. He chased that little boy with the mask of himself up Frederick's Lane and down Lincoln Avenue. He spun into Jangle Road so fast he almost fell down. The wind was blowing hard, and the trees were moving like they were getting ready to dance, and the whole thing made Ronald feel like he was flying, soaring after that little boy wearing his mask of Ronald. "Where'd you get that mask of me?" Ronald tried to say, but the wind caught his words and blew them away so hard he could hardly hear them himself. Where'd you, the wind spat back at him. Then finally the little boy turned onto Halloween Street, and Ronald felt pretty good about that, because he knew Halloween Street was a dead end. But he wasn't ready for all the kids trick-or-treating there. Hundreds of them, of all sizes, and all of them wearing these masks with Ronald's own face. "Where'd you get those masks of me?" Ronald cried out in confusion. "Where'd you get that mask of me?" they all chorused back in panic and fatigue. Where'd you? The wind gently crooned. And then there was nothing else to say. All the children with Ronald's face sat down on Halloween Street and said nothing. Ronald wondered if maybe they were all waiting for the real Ronald to stand up, for the real Ronald to make it perfectly clear exactly who was who. So the real Ronald stood up and tried to take his face off, just to show all the others that it wasn't a mask. And all the other real Ronalds stood up and tried to take their faces off, to finally put an end to the crowded masquerade. And all of Ronald's faces did come off. And there were the Willies, and the Anns, and the Bobbies, and the Janes. And there was no one named Ronald there at all. And no one could remember ever knowing any kid with such a strange name.
I will always love the idea, established in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, that Halloween is Monster Christmas. The things under the bed take the night off, the hungry ghosts grab a slice. We spend the most supernatural night of the year doing nothing but scaring ourselves. And that ties into this story, and the idea that our identity is defined by who is around us. I know that's the case for me. I'm very different around family members than I am around friends. In a work environment, I'm different once again. In the competitive environments I very occasionally find myself in, again, different. It's like focus being pulled, your level of direct interaction with the world changing as your emotional armour stacks up or stands down. But I'm always the same person under those filters, and I know there is someone under those filters. I can't imagine very much more terrifying than realising nothing's there, or perhaps that I no longer recognise who is. And that brings us to butcher paper, and to what fiction would feel like if it was espresso. Butcher paper is read for us by Setsu Uzume, editor at Podcastle, colossally talented writer, fiercely perceptive analyst and critic, and the eventual leader of the Escape Artists Horse Legions. So, have your butcher paper ready, because here comes another true story from Halloween Street.
Butcher paper. Jean had spent weeks arranging the outing. The terminal kids got out all too rarely, although most of them were still ambulatory. Just bureaucratic hospital regs that made no sense, anxieties over lawsuits. But she'd gotten to the right people and worn them down, and they put her in charge. The kids were given any materials they wanted so that they might construct their own costumes. The first few days, they just stared at the materials, picking up glue and markers and glitter and putting them right back down again, touching the giant roll of butcher's paper again and again as if it were silk, as if these were alien artifacts that they were handling. Objects which might have been contaminated with some rare disease. She wasn't prepared for what the kids finally came up with. Each kid had wrapped his or her body in the stiff brown butcher's paper. Wide rolls of tape were used to fasten the pieces together securely. When they were all done, they looked like a walking line of packages. Packages of meat. And that was the way they went out on Halloween Street. And that was the way they went out.
There's peace in not struggling. Not surrender. That distinction is vital. You can walk into the jaws of death itself knowing full well what waits for you out of choice, and that is not surrender, that is control. I've known people who've done that. But this is something else. This is pragmatism, fatalism, children far too young to know what it means to end, preparing to do that very thing. I learned about mortality very early. It's comforting, in a way. You know that there are certain things, certain places that every life will go. And on the good days, that's reassuring. And on the bad days, you understand the choice these kids make. And that brings us to the last house on the street, at least for this year, and Tricks. Tricks is read for you by Brian Lieberman. Brian is an associate editor of PseudoPod. By day, he's a copywriter and front-end developer at OBO Agency. By night, he fights various evils with his friends. He lives in Columbia, Maryland, with his wife, a roommate, a brooding rat, a school of fish, and a cat with no patience for his tomfoolery. So, get ready, one more time, for one more door, on one more house, on Halloween Street.
Tricks. It was supposed to be the last time they'd all go trick-or-treating together, but it didn't seem right that the gang go out now that Tommy was dead. Every year all the gang had gone trick-or-treating together. Allison and Robbie, Marianne and John, Sandra and Willona and Felix and Randall, and Tommy. They'd been doing it since 4th grade. Now they were teenagers, and they figured this was the last time, the last chance to do it upright. Not that they'd ever done anything particularly malicious on Halloween. A few soaped windows, a few mailboxes full of cow shit, not much more than that. But Tommy had said this particular Halloween needed to be special. For Christ's sakes, it's the last time. But then Tommy had died in that big pileup on the interstate. They'd all gone to the funeral. They'd seen the casket lowered into the ground, the earth dark as chocolate. It wasn't like in the movies. This movie, Tommy's movie, would last forever. Sandra kept saying that word, forever, like it was the first time she'd ever heard it. The dead liked playing tricks. She figured that out quick. Dying was a great trick. It was great because people just couldn't believe it. You'd play the trick right in front of their eyes, and they still just couldn't believe it. He'd only been dead a week when Sandra wondered if Tommy's life itself had been a trick. She couldn't remember his face anymore. Even when she looked at pictures of him, something felt wrong. Tommy had this trick. He was never going to change, and because he didn't change, she couldn't remember what he looked like. Sandra and Willona had both had crushes on Tommy, and now he was going to be their boyfriend forever. He used to take them both to the horror shows, even the ones they were too young for. He knew places he could get them in. Sandra thought about those shows a lot. She figured Willona did too. Tommy loved the horror shows. Now he was the star of his own horror show that played in their heads every night. He'd always be with them, because they just couldn't stop thinking about him. Sometimes it felt so great just to be alive, now that somebody you knew was dead. Sandra thought that must be the ugliest feeling in the world, but it was real. That was what Halloween was all about, wasn't it? Remembering the dead and celebrating hard because you weren't one of them. Tommy had liked Halloween the best of all of them. He'd been the one who'd organized all their parties, the one who'd come up with the tricks they would play. So this last night, as they went door to door, they thought of him when they called out, "Trick or treat!" They thought of him while they munched on the candy on their way to the next house, like they were eating his memory, a piece at a time. Halloween Street was always the last place to go. It was traditional. You could play the best tricks on Halloween Street, too, since none of the neighbors ever came out to bother you. You could just do whatever you pleased. Sandra led the way to the first house on the street, a tall thing missing most of its roof and leaning toward the rest of the block like it was drunk. She knocked on the door and knocked on the door until finally they gave up and started to go away. But as they turned away, the door opened and oranges came rolling out for all of them. They put them in their sacks and walked on down the street. At the next house, a wide place with fire damage on the outside walls, Willona did the knocking. An old man with no teeth gave each of them a peanut butter log, and then they left and walked down the street. The middle two houses looked even emptier than the others, twins that seemed to be looking at each other all the time with small window eyes. Marianne and John knocked at both houses, and at each house one of the old twin brothers who lived there gave them a box of raisins. By the time they all got to the end of the street, the sacks were getting heavy, unbelievably heavy, and Sandra insisted that they sit down to rest. The gang sat in a circle and reached into their sacks for the goodies. When Sandra looked in her sack, her orange had turned into Tommy's head, bleeding from a gash that crossed the crown of his head. When Willona reached into her sack for the peanut butter log, she found a slippery finger instead, Tommy's ring wedged on it so tightly she couldn't get it off no matter how hard she tried. What John and Marianne found in their sacks when they went looking for the raisins was a mass of black insects, each one carrying a small pale bit of Tommy's broken flesh. But the gang never said a word to each other about what they had found, nor did they show any alarm on their faces. They went on munching and smacking their lips, giggling to themselves because it was so good to be alive on this, the final Halloween of their childhoods, and thinking about how this was Tommy's last trick on them, and what a grand trick it was, and how this was their last trick on Tommy.
This story takes me to two very distinct places. The first is the old X-Files comic, published by Topps, no less, written by Stefan Prochucha and drawn by Charlie Adlard, before he got his call up to go draw The Walking Dead until the end of time. There's a particular story in there which involves the idea of cannibalism as a means of absorbing skill and memory. This particular exchange has lodged in my head for close to 20 years. Do you play the violin, Agent Mulder? No. Pity. I always wanted to be musical. Now, I can't remember if that's the exact way it plays out on the page, but that's the line I remember. And I remember the slick, salty taste of the idea, too. Immortality in consumption. Live forever as someone else's memories, someone else's skills. A neuron ghost. Banquo's aftertaste. The second thing it reminds me of is splitting up the CD collection of a friend of mine. He died about a week previously, and we'd been asked to go over and take what we wanted by his mum. He was entirely too young for this to happen. We were entirely too young to have any concept of how to deal with what had just happened. And he had a really good CD collection. So we split it up between us, and we rode this weird brain chemical cocktail of horror and grief, and shame and guilt, and excitement and relief. Horror and grief because no one who dies young should die young. Shame and guilt because we were picking over the life he'd made for himself in the period of time he'd been around to have one. Excitement and relief because I really loved House of Pain, still do, and because this was a way we could each carry part of him with us. A pop culture air burial. The body of his life divided between the people who loved him. It still sucked. It still does. 2 decades later, sometimes, but we didn't leave him behind, and that's what matters. Whereas, unfortunately, now we must leave Halloween Street. Thanks to Steve for the trip down this uniquely seasonal road, and our narrators for taking us there. And thanks to you for listening. At the top of the parade, as is always the case, comes the controller. And, as is always the case, your churros in one hand, your coffee in the other, you never actually see her appear. There's a sense of her stepping up from somewhere, even though nothing is beneath us to step up from. Then she walks to the centre of the road, stops, and waits for the attention she knows is due, and she knows will come. She claps her gloved hands once, and then she begins to walk. And the nightmares come after her. The old faithfuls first. The blonde mage and the cheerful goth woman, with eyes darker and deeper than time. The monk with his chained book. The vegetable god and his sometime allies, sometime foes. And joining them, carefully positioned at the back, a small, stocky man in his late 60s. He is immaculately dressed and has mischief in one eye and rage in another. Walking next to him is the living embodiment of human confusion, all muscle and pain, and a facial expression that says, "What?" He walks to the small man's right. On the other side, a woman keeps pace with them, whose form changes with every step. Lucille Ball becomes Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe becomes Mary Tyler Moore. Mary Tyler Moore becomes Dana Scully, and back around they go. And then come the podcasters. Clusters of people deep in discussion, using their shared true stories like others use flashlights. Light the way, see what's coming, fight it or get out of its way. The archivist is deep in conversation with most of them, eyes flicking between skeptical and worryingly, desperately convinced, as he hears stories of tunnels beneath old towns, of haunted ferry crashes, of murderous arcade machines. Nearby, a tall, stern man whose every aspect screams, "I do not believe you," is being talked at by the blonde mage. He doesn't look happy. The blonde mage, on the other hand, is having the time of his life. Off his right shoulder, shadow puppets and figures that move like old restless film make their way through their own personal patch of darkness, and at the centre of it, a studious-looking man makes notes, records their stories, records their lore. Nearby, the two radio DJs argue with their friend, the deputy. Truth-seekers, runners, journalists, archivists, narrators, engineers, tech support, hosts. Not one of them look the same. Not one of them look well rested, and they're clearly all having the time of their lives. The float is huge, much larger than any previous year, and just as crowded as ever. Blank cabinet arcade machines, a shed deep in the woods, a lighthouse, countless archives, a castle on a hill, wrapped in tentacles that look much shinier than they did last year. True stories all. AC/DC blares from the speakers and the Impala rounds the corner. This year's passengers, the female sheriff and the new, worried-looking young man are sitting in the back. The brothers in the front, as always. The angel, his coat wrapped around him, on the bonnet. The devil walking behind them, always immaculately dressed, always smiling. Behind him come their legion, the people they saved, the people they killed, the people they lost, and the ever-increasing number of people they found. Behind the Impala, the woman with the impossibly old gun walks. She's arm in arm with her sister, the cowboy off their right flank, the marshal off their left. The sister, she is into this, smiling and waving, having the time of her life. The cowboy, too, grinning, doffing his hat. The woman and the marshal, their eyes only see targets. Their eyes only see exit routes. Behind them comes a dirty green Ford, so clearly law enforcement and employment that it is practically wearing an FBI badge. The younger man in the passenger seat is staring intently at everything and everyone, with a mixture of enthusiasm and total surgical focus. The bigger, older man driving is staring straight ahead. The women in the back are looking anywhere but at each other. The mass that follows them is an idea with a single voice and 100,000 faces. The herd, because make no mistake, this is a herd of the dead, move with the singular insect-like purpose of non-sentience, their eyes glazed, their rotting jaws clacking on imagined flesh. In amongst them you spot a young man with long hair. He is covered in blood. It's not his. He is smiling, not because he survived, but because he is, at last, alone. Bringing up the rear of the herd are the other zombies. The smart ones, the urbane ones, the ones with jobs and artisanal beef tacos where the beef is grey and used to have a name and a face. The young woman with the shock of white hair leads them, careful not to make eye contact with the soldiers nearby. Next to her, the tall, bearded scientist grins, sips tea, and scratches at his arm. Behind them come the survivors. The man who used to be a sheriff and who learned how to be a leader, the farmer's daughter turned commander of armies, the feral tracker whose family is now so much more than his bike, his bow, his brother. The king. The king's tiger. The king's aide. Most of them are walking point, weapons ready but saved. The king's tiger roars as good-naturedly as tigers can. The king's aide, he high-fives every single one of the people on the rail. The doctors follow them. Two groups, one a little faded in the colour scheme, with hair that screams 1990s. They don't make eye contact with anyone, least of all each other. Well, aside from one. He's deep in conversation with a gentleman who looks very much like him, a little older, perhaps wiser, although the terrified group of younger doctors and medical students he's shepherding probably disagree with that. The clown comes last, dancing and capering around the two sets of children. Neither of them are frightened, back to back as they walk the streets, some in Ghostbusters outfits, some in 90s clothes. At their centre, the only two who aren't white stand, weapons raised. One has a catapult, the other a book. The only two girls stand with them. Silver glitters in one's palm. The other is staring at the clown. Her nose is starting to bleed. She's smiling. And then the controller, again, as ever, rounding the parade out as she starts it. But this year, something is different. This year she's not alone. The woman walking with her wears a single glove, something medical to its cut. She has shades on, a fabulous dress, and the walk of someone getting used to not being bowed down anymore. She is the last person we see this year, and just as the director started so specifically, she closes the parade with certainty, a bow, and a smile. She survived. We survived. Again. We rely on you to pay our authors, cover our server costs, and keep each one of our 4 ships afloat. In order to do that, you can do 2 things. The first is click on pseudopod.org and click on Feed the Pod. There you'll be given 2 options. Donate is as much as you want. Subscribe starts from about $5 a month. Alternatively, you can subscribe through Patreon, where we have a regular ongoing feed of stuff about our adventures, and there's a lot of escape artists, and we get up to a lot of stuff, so there's normally something on there, and regular audio episodes with myself and Karen Bovenmeier, talking about various geeky things. Alternatively, if you can't afford to help, and we do know things are tough at the moment, then you can help by spreading the word. Leave a review for us on iTunes, talk about us on social media, pick a story that you liked and review it on your blog. And if you do any of these things, please get in contact, because we love getting stuff like this, and we'll cross-promote it. We'll boost the signal for you. Likewise, if you have a podcast and you'd like one of us to be on it, reach out. We all love to talk, and we all love talking about this job. So, like I say, if you fancy a guest who wants to talk about horror, let us know. We'll see you in November with Passover by Caspian Gray, and we leave you with this quote from Ray Bradbury's The Halloween Tree, which, as both Mr. Bradbury and Mr. Rasnic know, is in the park at the end of Halloween Street. And they also know that this is a production of Escape Artists Incorporated and released under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives license. That quote: "When you reach the stars, boy, yes, and live there forever, all the fears will go, and death himself will die." Happy Halloween, folks. We'll see you next week.